about her latest book titled Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation Against Gender Revolutions. So please also know that this talk is also co-sponsored by the Middle East Graduate Committee. So thank you for your sponsoring support, and then we really appreciate it. So after her about 35 to 40 minutes talk, we will be having a Q&A session as well. So please join me in welcoming the Dr. Sahar Khamis.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much to the Department of Communications Colloquium Committee, especially my colleagues Harley and June, for their efforts in putting the event together and also putting the flyer together for the event. And thanks so much to the Middle East Graduate Field Committee, especially Professor Peter Bain, Hagar Atiyah, our own Hagar Atiyah from Communication, and all the rest of the Middle East program at the University of Maryland for sponsoring the event. So the talk is going to be about my newest book, which is a co-edited volume, with Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, co-edited by myself and Professor Amal Bibi. So here is the book physically, and here is the book virtually. Since we are communication scholars, we also like to have both, the physical hard copy as well as the digital copy, and it's of course available online and through Baltic Macmillan, Amazon, and as an ebook as well. So about the book, let me just give you very briefly an idea about the book before we start discussing the themes. And the book, of course, is edited by myself. I'm an Egyptian American. I've been here a professor at the University of Maryland for the last 11 years and got my tenure in 2014. Amal Bibi, my co-editor, is a Tunisian American scholar. And she's actually has been working as a judge in Tunisia before, which is important because we're going to be talking about the legal aspect and things related to legislation when it comes to the status of Arab women. It includes contributions by a number of experts on gender-related topics. Some of them are from within the Arab region, some of them are from outside the Arab region, some of them are from Arab Spring countries, and some are from non-Arab Spring countries, and also we have a male author as well. We don't believe in the idea of excluding men from discussions about women because we think it's not helpful to do so. We believe we should invite everybody to the table who has something useful to say. So the book consists of 12 chapters written by 11 authors, some of them, as I said, from different countries. So we have Nada Al-Wadi from Bahrain, Rita Stefan, Lebanese American, Deborah Harold from the US, Asma Nwera from Tunisia, Nahid Al-Tantawi, Egyptian American, Naimi Nisribani from Japan, Sana Jelasi from Jordan, Lubna Fablish Hazzam, Irish German, and Brahim Al-Wabli, a Moroccan American. So we did not save any effort to have some kind of diversity and inclusion among our contributors to this volume. The book was kindly and generously endorsed by Professor Hamid Dabashi of Columbia University, Professor Dina Matar of the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Professor Noha Miller of the University of Bedfordshire in England, as well as our own Professor Valerie Orlando from the School of Languages, Literature, and Culture here at the University of Maryland. So why this book? Why do we actually need to study this particular theme of Arab women's activism? We need to deconstruct some of the myths and false stereotypes about Arab women who have been historically depicted as powerless, marginalized, weak, or highly sexualized erotic objects, or all of the above, revealing some of the phases and faces of Arab women's multiple activisms and resistances, and please notice the plural S here, because we don't believe there is one uniform or standard form of activism or resistance, or even feminism for that matter. Plurality and diversity is very important. And these activisms and resistances, we argue, have been intertwined with the lived political and social realities in their respective countries, illustrating how these activisms and resistances cross-cut the political, social, and legal spheres simultaneously. So much talk has been on the political aspect, the Arab Spring, women's activism politically. But hey, we're also trying in this book to say, there are also social and legal activisms which are equally important. Illustrating how these activisms and resistances extended before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprising. So some people would glorify the Arab Spring moment, and yes, we will talk about it this afternoon because it's very important. But it's not the only moment of activism for these women. Their activism started way before the Arab Spring, during the Arab Spring, and after the Arab Spring. And also, as we said, in different countries, some of them are Arab Spring countries, and some of them are non-Arab Spring countries, but in different forms, different intensities, and different directions. Shedding light on some of the most important opportunities, threats, and uncertainties facing Arab women's movements today, and deconstructing the notion of a uniform, standard, and fixed form of feminism, which is oftentimes defined within a narrow, ethnocentric Western perspective only. And this leads to what we call the Save the Muslim Woman syndrome. So you get a French feminist who thinks that, oh, we should save these women in Afghanistan, but maybe she does not know all the realities about their lived lives, their culture, their identity, their religious beliefs, and so on. So we need to move away from this into a more encompassing form of feminisms with a plural S. We argue that there are three layers of invisibility and marginalization that women in general, Arab women and Muslim women in particular, have historically been suffering from. First, invisibility on the socio-economic level, because women's work is not documented. Oftentimes it's undocumented or informal labor. Because she does not get a paycheck every 2 weeks or every month, she thinks of herself as not working. So you ask the woman, what are you doing? She will say, oh, I'm not working. I'm just a housewife. And when you ask her when she wakes up at 5:30 in the morning and does not go to bed until 10 p.m. She works more than 12, 13 hours continuously. That's work. But it's not documented work. So that is called socioeconomic invisibility. Also, there is invisibility in academic literature, which either underrepresented or obscure the complex lived realities of women. This book is an attempt to try to counter this marginalization and to defy this invisibility. It's only been recent that we started to have departments of women's studies that I'm proudly an affiliate member of here, faculty member of, gender studies, women's studies, LGBTQ studies. These are all new. But in the literature, originally there has been little about the representation of lived realities of women. And third, there is invisibility in the media, through either the exclusion or the underrepresentation or misrepresentation of women's voices, identities, and images and realities, through stereotypical, false, and skewed misrepresentations which either depict them as oppressed and helpless beings or as overly sexualized objects or both. So we argue in this book that there are actually three parallel struggles that Arab women have been going through: the political struggle, the social struggle, and the legal struggle. The political struggle, of course, is to free their countries from the forces of dictatorship, autocracy, and authoritarianism. So across the board, women from different ideological orientations, backgrounds, socioeconomic levels, ages, you name it, they came out in huge numbers. Even in some of the most traditional countries, like Bahrain or Yemen, in the region, they still really stunned the world with their activism and determination. These political resistance movements extended, as I said before, during, and after the Arab Spring movements, and took different forms and different degrees of intensity. But of course, whenever we talk about political struggles and political activism, the Arab Spring always comes to mind. One good example was Egyptian women's active involvement in a group known as No Military Trials for Civilians, which was created when SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in Egypt, took over during the transitional period following the deposing of President Mohammed Morsi, following the deposing of President Mubarak, and before President Mohammed Morsi got elected to office in 2013. During this period, Egyptian women such as Mona Saif and the lawyer Rajia Umran assumed positions of leadership in this group, setting bright examples of women's bravery, heroism, and courage. And in this particular case, you see women not just participating or joining movements, they're actually leading the movement. They are at the forefront. They are the leaders of these movements. And that really is very important and very iconic. Of course, needless to say, reversals in freedom and democratization in the region, as we have witnessed in some of these countries, there have been some tragic outcomes and things did not go as desired or hoped for, had negative implications on civic movements in general, and women's involvement and activism within these movements in particular. So when the margin of freedom, democracy shrinks, so will the involvement in these movements as well, and also women's participation in them naturally. is the social struggle to resist different forms of discrimination, prejudice, and bias against women, as well as different negative practices against them, harmful practices, such as sexual harassment, for example. One good example that the book talks about, our contributor to the book, Nahid al-Tantawi, Egyptian-American scholar, she writes about a successful campaign called شفت تحرش, which means I saw harassment, and an application which is called Harassment. These were really created by both active young women and men, again inviting men to the picture and having them join the struggle, because women's rights are human rights, that's how we see it. So everybody should join this kind of fight and struggle. They created the شفت تحرش campaign, which is I saw harassment, and also the app which is Harassment, which is really a map which shows you areas that had the highest level of harassment. So if an area has so many incidents of sexual harassment, you will see a red zone about this area, like basically don't go there or be alert or call the police or do something. This illustrates also a spillover from the realm of citizen journalism to the realm of mainstream media in an effort to influence public opinion on these issues. So one of these bloggers, very famous Nawara Nigm, a young Egyptian blogger who actually used her blog that had hundreds of thousands of followers and her Twitter that had hundreds of thousands of followers for the purpose of both social and political activism. So she was one of the people who started to say we have to talk about sexual harassment. We cannot just keep turning a blind eye, because that's a problem. So I would argue here that these women were really breaking taboos on two levels. Politically, by talking about things like governmental corruption and violations of human rights and autocracy and dictatorship, but also socially, by talking about things like domestic violence and sexual harassment on the streets and so on. And the third one, which I really feel has been like a blind spot in a lot of the literature on women, is the legal struggle. And I believe this is one of the strong contributions of this book, because as I said, my co-editor has been a judge herself in Tunisia. She has written in the book about the laws and the regulations and how they have been changing. That is very important. The legal struggle to either pass new laws and legislations, which can be useful and beneficial for women, or to change existing laws and legislations, which are discriminating against women. One good example is the passing of a new groundbreaking law against domestic violence in Tunisia, which was hailed by many for its comprehensiveness, gender equity, and inclusion, since it prohibited all forms of violence against women, whether physically, sexually, socially, economically, or politically. So let me pause here and explain this a little bit. In the past, domestic violence or violence against women is seen as a private issue. Oh, her husband slapped her. Why should we even care? That's a private issue. No, it's not a private issue. This is a societal issue. Nobody should be harassed, and nobody should be beaten, and nobody should be violated, right? So this law is groundbreaking. It's number 19 universally, like in the whole world, and really the first in the Arab world, right? So it's something to say, if you prevent a woman from running for office just because she's a woman, that's a form of discrimination and violence against women. If you deny her a job or deny her equal pay just because she's a woman, this is also violence against women. So by doing so, this law took the issue of violence against women out of the private domestic sphere into the public sphere. It also raised the age of marriage for women, prohibited all forms of gender-based discrimination, and most importantly, eliminated a law which is known as the law of shame, which enabled the rapist to escape punishment through marrying his victim. A horrible law. I mean, it's like you're punishing the victim twice. One time by being raped, and one time by marrying her rapist. That's why it was called the law of shame. So this law was eradicated, and this was emulated in other Arab countries who started to follow the footsteps of Tunisia, such as Lebanon and Jordan. So they also eliminated this law, which I don't think should exist anywhere on the planet. The involvement of women in drafting this law, as has been historically the case elsewhere, was a major driving force behind the victory, exemplified in passing this new law, as well as previous gender-sensitive issues. So basically, when you are at the table, you will not be on the menu. When you are not at the table, you will be on the menu. If women are part and parcel of the drafting of these laws and legislations and taking decisions and acting as judges and lawmakers, that really changes things big time for women. Here it's useful to highlight that women across the board in Tunisia, including those from the moderate Islamist party Al-Nahda, as well as from secular liberal camps, collaborated together, and they helped each other and cooperated in their effort for many years across the board and across the ideological differences to pass this law. So it teaches us a lesson that when people come together across the ideological differences, it makes a huge difference at the end of the day. Although there has been, generally speaking, a positive correlation, like we said, between the degree of political freedom allowed in a certain country and the progress made in terms of women's rights, whether politically, socially, or legally, one interesting paradox that this book talks about, it's really an anomaly, is the case of Bahrain, which myself and my co-author Nada Al-Wadi, an activist and journalist from Bahrain, wrote about in this book. The crackdown on political opposition in Bahrain by the regime in power resulted in getting rid of some of the very conservative Shiite religious scholars who were opposed to passing some good laws that were really giving women more rights, like a new family law in Bahrain which would give women some rights, such as passing and granting the Bahraini citizenship to their children if they're married to foreigners, non-Bahrainis. So this is a case really which is paradoxical and an anomaly when you see a political crackdown lead to some kind of opening of a door for women to have more rights and to have a good law. This is not the case, it's pretty much the paradox and the anomaly, but we also felt it's important to account for it in this book. There are also three phases of feminisms, with a plural S, that the book talks about. The first phase was nationalism and fighting colonialism, and in this particular phase, the struggle for women's liberation was pretty much intertwined with the struggle to liberate their own countries from foreign powers. The leaders of this early stage were mostly urban, upper middle class, elitist, Western educated men, who were then joined by upper middle class, elitist, Western educated women, which is why some feminists would say, is this really feminism to start with, right? They would have a little bit of an issue with it, because it was pretty much elitist and top down, not really coming from the grassroots, from the bottom up. And the second phase was the post-colonial stage of modern nation building, and in this stage, most of the vision for women's independence and liberation was mostly coming from the new leaders. It was shaped by the new leaders of these countries, whether it was Nasser in Egypt with his socialist agenda, or Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia with his secular Western-oriented agenda, which is controversial. Some people hail him so much, including my co-editor, would say he is fantastic, And of course he did great things because the literacy rate in Tunisia is very high, over 90%, right? The level of achievement, women working as judges, all of that is groundbreaking. But of course, for some other camps in the Middle East, through the more conservative, traditional camps would have a big frown on their face because he really adopted a very Western agenda. Abortion is allowed anywhere, complete sexual freedom and so on, which is not always fitting with the fabric of the region, but that's a big discussion for another day. So this stage also brought about a syndrome, which was called the First Lady Syndrome, whereby the First Lady, right, would be the one to dictate the agenda for women's issues, whether she was Suzanne Mubarak or before her, Jihad Sadat, and they were the ones who really to say, okay, we're going to have a council for women's issues, or this particular, body to legislate for women's rights, and so on and so forth. Again, mixed feelings, because some feminists will say, wait a minute, this is just top-down, elitist, and not really representing all women, and others will say, but hey, the fact that these first ladies actually cared about women's issues brought about some gains, right? So again, there is a mixed vision here in terms of how we want to see it. Therefore, it could be said that these two early phases of Arab women's feminism, despite the multiple gains that they brought for women, we cannot deny that, in terms of increasing the salience, recognition, and visibility of women's issues and women's rights, were pretty much characterized by being top-down elitist movements, which did not always trickle down effectively or sufficiently to a wider segment of women in various Arab countries. It wasn't until the third phase of Arab women's feminism, which accompanied the so-called Arab Spring movements and uprisings, that we started to witness a trickle-down effect and the emergence of what we can call bottom-up grassroots activisms. So this third phase of Arab Spring movements was characterized by being grassroots popular movements, peaceful protests. The violence came from the regimes, not from the protesters. Across the board, grassroots, semi-leaderless. There were some leaders, but they were not, visible or at the forefront. Significant role played by youth and significant role played by women. Social media also acted as catalysts and amplifiers for change. Different outcomes resulted and unfolded in various countries, both politically and socially. These are, broadly speaking, the most important characteristics of these movements. Women's activism in the Arab Spring, women played a visible role in the Arab Spring movements. Many took part in what we can describe as non-stereotypical gender roles. In other words, in these movements, as the book discusses in many chapters, women were not just playing supportive roles, nurturing and nursing and supporting men. Rather, they were pretty much in the front lines of resistance. They were really paying a high risk of being killed, injured, arrested, detained, losing their job, losing their freedom. It's no joke when you go out in some of these protests, especially in this part of the world, you can really pay a very high price. And women did pay this high price. That's why I say it's not acceptable that after the movement they're told, thank you so much ladies, it's now time to go back to the kitchen. Sorry, you cannot tell us that. The selection of Tawakkul Qarnan, the Yemeni activist and journalist who came to be known as the mother of the revolution in Yemen. Again, Yemen is a very traditional conservative country. She was the first Arab woman to ever receive the Nobel Prize, signified international recognition for the Arab Spring movements in general, and Arab women's role and activism in these movements in particular. And there are so many role models that we can talk about. One of them also is Asma Mahfouz, the 25-year-old girl at that time who uploaded a vlog. Young people, you know the vlog, which is like when you vlog using video, this is called a vlog. So she uploaded this vlog, which made her really the most brave girl in Egypt. That's how they describe her, the most brave girl in Egypt, talking about autocracy, corruption. We have to fight Mubarak, we have to go out in huge numbers, and we have to topple this regime. Something that a lot of men do not have the courage to even say 1/100 of what she has said in this vlog. So if you have a chance to just look her up and look January 25, 2011 vlog, it's there, and it's really delightful to watch. This woman here, I chose her because she's just a very average middle-class Egyptian woman. You can just see her anywhere in the streets of Cairo, right? And here she is in the heart of Tahrir Square, holding this banner and saying, please release this activist from jail. This guy, Wa'il Ghunim, who was one of the leaders of the revolution, but he was one of the iconic young leaders who tried to help push the revolution forward. He was detained for 12 days, and she's saying, please free him from this detention. It's unfair. We don't want any more victims or people to be arrested or detained. Very average, very middle-class woman. You can see her anywhere. And that's the beauty of these movements, is bringing about the bottom-up grassroots activism and the engagement of average women across the board. So, the book, I think, makes an effort to try to redefine activism and resistance. I believe, or I hope, this is our humble contribution to academic knowledge here. The emergence of bottom-up horizontal grassroots activism, which engages the widest possible segments of women, denouncing government manufactured activism, which can result in tokenism or cosmetic feminism, like the First Lady syndrome. The birth of empowerment as an indigenous, autonomous effort on the part of women themselves to enact change with their own hands and to speak in their own voice, not to have someone else speak for them. The birth of parallel political revolutions, which involves resistance in the socio-political domains simultaneously. So it's not just political, it is political and social, and we will add here political and social and legal, which are the three parallel struggles we want to highlight in this book. The role of cyberfeminism, I know my communication colleagues are waiting like, where's the communication part in this? The term cyberfeminism refers to a process whereby women deploy new forms of communication, mainly online communication, to advocate for their own rights, causes, and demands, and to fight various forms of discrimination, injustice, and repression. It is considered a sister term for the phenomena of cyber activism, which means the use of online tools of communication to advance a cause which is difficult to advance offline. Women hail the role of new media in serving the needs of women and helping their causes in particular, as well as the role in defining power and authority in general, both politically and socially. Three main functions were defined here for cyberfeminism, when women were asked, like, what is really the advantage of using social media or new media? They really highlighted three main functions: mobilization, documentation, and education. Mobilization, of course, by rallying support for certain causes. You bring people together, you can collect funds, donations, create organizations, bring about resources, start new movements, all of that. We have seen that clearly in the case specifically of Syrian women. Of course, Syria having the worst humanitarian crisis in modern times altogether for the last 7 years, a lot of what has been happening. So they created organizations online to start to help the refugees and help rape victims and people who lost their women who lost their male spouses and male supporters and so on. Documentation using their own cameras and using their own cell phones as their weapons. As one activist told me, my cell phone is my weapon. If anybody tries to come close to me or harass me or arrest me, I'm going to use my cell phone and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to expose this person not just to an Egyptian public, but to an international public everywhere, because it's going to go viral on YouTube in a few minutes. Education, of course, raising awareness about women's issues and discussing them through what they described as positive media. So they said if the mainstream media is not doing the job of really showing who we are and really kind of expressing our causes and needs and rights and wants, hey, let's create an alternative parallel type of media. Maybe we can call it positive media, right? To try to really advocate for our own causes. Maybe we can create our own YouTube channel or our own blog, our own website, and so on. However, just like everything else in life, we cannot just hail social media as the end all be all, because it's not. It also proved to have some limitations. And some of these limitations were, while they may aid socio-political change as catalysts, they can speed it up, they can be amplifiers, they can be factors that can help. They are not magical tools, and they cannot bring about change all by themselves. It's always the people on the ground, in this case, women themselves, who can create actual change in the real world if and when they decide to do so. It is wise to adopt the reform approach of what we can call cyber realism, which avoids the two undesirable extremes of cyber pessimism or cyber optimism. Cyber optimism is like, yeah, the Facebook revolution in Egypt, the Twitter uprising in Tunisia. No, there were actually people on the ground putting their own lives at risk in order for this revolution to happen. These social media tools were just catalysts. They can speed up, they can amplify, but they do not create the revolution. This is important. Cyber pessimism means like, looking down at these tools and saying, oh, it doesn't matter. We can do without them, they're not important. So in this book, we argue for a middle ground of cyber realism. Let's acknowledge their contributions, but also equally be aware of their limitations. So, let's talk about some of the gains, opportunities, threats, and uncertainties. The gains and opportunities, Arab women today have a lot of opportunities to fight for their causes, spread their messages, and make their voices heard in many unprecedented ways. Social media are providing Arab women today with the needed window to see the rest of the world and to be seen by the rest of the world. So it's a two-way process, as well as the needed tools to organize, network, and mobilize. The affordability, accessibility, interactivity, and immediacy of these tools made them especially important in enacting socio-political change. The rise of new young Arab women activists who are actually combining online and offline activism to fight for their political, social, and legal rights is particularly important and useful for women, as it increases the salience and visibility of women's issues and helps to secure support for them. Very important. Many of these young women activists became public opinion leaders who are really setting good role models and positive examples, not just for other women, but for society as a whole, for all citizens, men and women alike. And one example that the book talks about is a young activist, Ayat al-Umaysi, the 20-year-old activist at the time, in the midst of the revolution uprising in Bahrain. She stood up in the heart of Pearl Square and she recited a poem that got her arrested afterwards, in which she actually criticized the king and his family, and she told him, "You stole things from us." I just want you to imagine this. A 20-year-old woman in the middle of a conservative, traditional society in the Gulf, standing up and talking to the royal family and to the king, saying, "You stole things from us." It was unprecedented, unheard of. And some of the men said, "We wish we had half the courage and half the bravery of this young woman." So this is groundbreaking. It shatters all the myths and the stereotypes about women being helpless and powerless and sexual objects, because hey, they're now breaking new ground and becoming role models and public opinion leaders, not just for women, but also for men. The increase in youth activism is very important, really important to talk about, and very relevant when it comes to supporting women's issues, since both youth and women were perceived to be two sides of the same coin of activism. And many of the women we talked about, like Nawara Negm, the prominent blogger, Asma Mahfouz, the prominent vlogger, if we may use this term, right? All of these women, they were really, I'm losing the voice here. Are you still able to hear me?
Yeah.
Are you still able to hear me? Okay. So many of these women really were young women under the age of 40. They were under 40 years of age when they actually engaged in these activisms and engaged in these forms of resistance. Youth are the fastest growing segment of the population in the Arab world and in many parts of the world where reform and democratization is needed. Young people or youth represent 70% of the population in the Arab world, and they are now agents of change. They're technologically savvy, they are risk takers, they master new tools of communication and new media, and they're able to really have their voices heard, which makes their own, the involvement of young women. So now there are young women involved in these movements particularly important and particularly relevant. So the threats and challenges, the reversals in freedom in post-Arab Spring countries, the shift from solidarity to fragmentation and polarization, creating an unsafe public space for women through sexual harassment, violence, virginity testing, and rape. These have been very, very tragic and very negatively affecting women's activism and participation in these movements in this part of the world. Reversals of freedom, of course, we have seen countries like Syria having a civil war, Yemen and Libya having sectarian strife and violence, Egypt having a reversal or going back to a form of autocracy or dictatorship. Maybe Tunisia comes up as the only exception where we see some kind of smooth transition to democratization and reform. But particularly for women, an unsafe public space means if you go out and demonstrate or revolt, there's always the risk that you can face things like harassment, sexual harassment, rape, all of that stuff can also be a price that you pay because you are a woman. So it's trying to intimidate women. The rise of political Islam from the perspective of some of the liberal secular camps and critics, they've been very, very skeptical about the rise of political Islam in some of these countries because they were afraid that this would translate into some kind of agenda which is much more restrictive and repressive of women. The reactionary patriarchal culture and stagnant traditions that still exist in many of these countries are also an obstacle. Educational, economic, and infrastructural constraints. The fact that women in many of these countries do not have the same equal access to resources in terms of education, employment, getting positions, being hired, all of that stuff. The overshadowing and marginalization of women's roles and contributions despite their numerous sacrifices. So like we said before, after the revolution is over, thank you ladies, you can now go back to the kitchen. And in fact in Egypt, after the Egyptian revolution of 2011, women wanted to organize a million women march in Tahrir Square. Only 500 women showed and they were told, go to the hair salon and do your nails. It's not time for these issues, now we are building the country. And I just wonder, isn't women's issues part and parcel of building the country? It is part of the political, economic, and social development of the country. This very narrow vision of like sidelining, just brushing off women's issues, they're not important, they can wait, let's talk about them later. So these are all combined together, obstacles, threats, and challenges still facing women in the region. And of course, the uncertainties ahead. The future of Arab women's movements and the gains they can actually secure moving forward are very much related to the future of their own countries, many of which are in flux or even in limbo and chaos, without any clear roadmap at the present time. This is applicable in countries that had, like we said, civil war like Syria, sectarian strife and violence like Libya and Yemen, or a reversal in freedom and recycling of the old regime like Egypt, or an invisible forgotten uprising like Bahrain that nobody talks about, so we're trying in this book to give it some visibility and recognition. The only exception here being Tunisia, which secured some reasonable political and social gains, and I believe this is because of the high literacy rate in general, high literacy rate among women in particular, and also enabling women to have more empowerment and to be part of the judicial process and to act as judges. This is very important. So basically, we're wrapping up, so bear with me a few more minutes. Reflections and findings. The parallel struggles which Arab women have been taking part in, whether the political, social, or legal spheres, over all of these spheres together over many decades, developed and evolved over several stages, extending before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings. These struggles are closely intertwined with the complex realities witnessed in different Arab countries, and they could be said to be both mirrors and molders, causes and effects of these different shifting realities, since they are both contributing to them as well as being shaped and influenced by them simultaneously in a cyclical, ongoing, intertwined process. The importance and significance of women's active participation and involvement in decision-making processes, as well as drafting new laws and regulations in the respective countries, makes a huge difference and leads to significant gains. The significance of coalition building and bridging the differences between different groups representing different ideological orientations, as we have seen in the case of Tunisia. I'd love to see this model emulated elsewhere, and people learn in order to work together doesn't mean we have to be identical. We can still be different, but we have to know how to build coalitions and how to bridge our differences and work together effectively. The success of bottom-up grassroots activism, like we said, this is very important because this is the people themselves coming up and talking for themselves, and acknowledging the contributions as well as the limitations of the phenomena of cyber activism in general and cyber feminism in particular. It is useful to bear in mind that the developments witnessed in the realm of Arab women's activisms and resistances cross-cuts a number of diametrically opposed binaries, and oftentimes evolves and develops at the intersections between them. These include, but are not limited to, hegemony versus resistance, religiosity versus secularization, globalization versus localization, the private sphere versus the public sphere, and the online versus the offline. So we're making the argument through these 12 chapters in the book that at the intersection of these binary opposites, new forms of women's activisms, empowerment, and resistance is always being created every day in different forms and different shapes. So my last slide, a final word. In looking ahead, it would be wise to adopt a realistic, balanced approach in predicting the future of women's movements and activism and their varied forms of activism and resistances in the context of ongoing socio-political transformation in this ever-changing region, which acknowledges their gains and contributions, but also takes into account the challenges and threats which are confronting them simultaneously. And I would add also the endless list of uncertainties as well. In doing so, we can be gratified by what has been accomplished, but we should be humbled by what remains to be achieved. Thank you very much.
To boost and satisfy our intellectual
For the last 10 minutes, my mind is thinking about the microphone. Why has not been working?
To satisfy our intellectual curiosity, and also because there is no fear of public speaking in the Department of Communication. So when you have any questions about her talk, just feel free to ask.
Okay. Now your turn to talk, and try to talk as much as possible to give me a break. Okay, Nick, make the long question.
You don't have to ask twice. So I, throughout my life, have ideologically been a strong proponent of grassroots movements, but recently have found myself challenging that notion both in terms of empirical findings and other things. One of the things that you note is that the Arab Spring effectively starts in Tunisia, and that's where we see the most gains, but there's also a groundwork laid there potentially for that success politically, with additional political rulings that happen before then predate these things. One of the points that you end up making is that we should eschew these two earlier stages of feminism that prescribe to the top-down approaches that tend to be mostly focused on elites making changes in favor of the bottom-up. But we've seen a lot of failure of grassroots movements recently, and I'm wondering if there are necessary preconditions. Are these actually stages of feminism that need to happen in a specific order?
Are these actually, say that again, are these actually?
Are these,
Of the grassroots.
are these, I actually don't remember exactly what I said, but I think to rephrase, right, are there necessary preconditions for grassroots movements to even be successful? Are the initial stages of feminism that you described actually necessary preconditions that maybe reflect grassroots movements being effective later on? Or if not, what are the other things that are differentiating where these have been successful versus where they're not?
This is $1 million question. Because really, one of the most important blind holes here, one of the important gaps that we have is what we can call a chicken and egg question when it comes to civic engagement and civic activism on one hand, and democratization efforts on the other hand. By that I mean, we say that in order to have democracy, right, you need to have an active civil society. NGOs, opposition parties, people should express their views, there should be grassroots activism. But here's the chicken and egg part. In order to have this kind of civic engagement and people being encouraged to go out and to create opposition parties and movements and grassroots activism and NGOs, they need to have a certain degree of freedom and democracy, right? So in a way, you have this chicken and egg question, which I would be lying to you if I said I have a 100% complete, accurate, comprehensive solution or even an answer to. I myself, I'm still pretty much grappling with it. I'm still very much like really trying to find out where can you really start? Because you made the brilliant point about Tunisia, right? The cradle of the Arab Spring, as my co-editor calls it in her chapter, did have this predating history of more rights for women, having judges, which is not something available in other Arab countries, 90% literacy rate, the rest of the region has staggeringly high, shamefully high, illiteracy rates, women, going to the workforce in larger numbers. When I talked about Bourguiba, that's why I said it's controversial, because some people hail him so much like a hero, some people criticize him. But no matter where you stand on this, you cannot undermine the accomplishments he has done for Tunisia. Very important. And yes, of course, you can argue that this really kind of paved the floor for the Tunisian uprising, and most importantly, for the relative success of Tunisia now compared to the rest of the region, the notion of Tunisian exceptionalism. And I say relative because I know Tunisian friends are like, no, we still have a long way to go. I'm like, yeah, but you're better off than the rest of the region. You still have a long way to go, there is no question. We're not saying you accomplished everything you want to do, but at least you're not having the same degree of turmoil or chaos or disruption and so on that we witness elsewhere. And I do credit everything you mentioned for this, and I think that this is one of the things I would personally like to address in my own scholarship moving forward. So I had an article called The Transformative Egyptian Media Landscape. I wrote it in 2011, when the Egyptian revolution just happened. And I was euphoric, because I'm a human being, I have a subjectivity. That's what I tell my students in my 715, right? There is no such thing as 100% complete objectivity. I'm a woman, I'm a scholar, I'm also Egyptian, I'm also American, and I'm also very much tied to this region, and I was very euphoric when I saw this revolution happen. And if you read my article, it's like, yeah, and this is really awesome. I even gave a talk in the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, and I was like, this is history, Egyptians made history, Arab women, this is fantastic, there is no going back. And after I finished, the moderator said, thank you so much, Dr. Khamis, but don't you think you're a little bit upbeat? And now, 7 years later, I'm like, yeah, maybe I was a little upbeat. So now I want to go back again and to revisit this article that I have written then in this moment of euphoria in 2011. Now that we are in 2018, right, and I'm 7 years wiser, not older, but wiser, maybe I need to go back again and to revisit all of these notions and really find out where are some of the gaps and things that need to be readdressed and filled up. Thank you so much. It's Mike?
Yes. First, Dr. Khamis, thank you so much for this very enlightening talk and a needed topic to be studied and continues to be studied. As you said, Dr. Khamis, we think we know a lot about women in the Arab world, but as much as we know, I think there is so much more to learn. So thank you. I want to come back to several things you said, but I'll try to be brief. You talked about that center when you talked about the cyber media and the cyber women and the cyber communication. I think that's your key issue. You talked about binaries and you said their intersection is where maybe the women's movement is being able to move forward and to be creative and to lead. I think that is the key. That is the key, including top down and bottom up. It's that center. You need the top down and you need the bottom up. You need your elite women who are highly educated and who are highly networked and who have so many links. And you need your bottom up. So it's that center. It's where the two binaries meet, where women can walk through, run through, lead through, and change society. So your center is key. And I think that's where we shine. May I say one more thing? You're right to say Tunisia is leading. My question would be, what if foreign interference happens in Tunisia the way it happened in Lebanon, when Lebanon was leading on women's issues and it got toppled. So I would like to see one chapter about foreign interference.
The person who asked this question, everybody, is Mary Hani, the Khalil Gibran chair here at the University of Maryland. If there's anybody who knows about women and women's issues in the Arab world, it's Mary Hani.
No, I knew.
She has done incredible work over many, many years. You know, recognized internationally, her publications, her contributions. When I met her, I was like, wow, you know, how did you have time to do all of
Professor
that?
Khamis, I would say the same thing about you.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. So her question is really very much on target. The first one is a comment. It is at the intersection of all of these different binaries that we talked about, that we can really see new forms of resistances, activisms, emerging and coming up. This is very true. Because if you see yourself as diametrically opposed from the other and you cannot bridge the differences or bridge the gaps, forget about coalition building, forget about cooperation. As I said in my talk, one of the points that I credit Tunisia and Tunisian women for has been this ability to really kind of work across the board, across their differences, across their ideological divides, whether they're secular, Islamist, or somewhere in between, to try to come up with new rules, new regulations, and new laws for women, which I think is very, very important. But then your question about foreign intervention is very much on target, because Tunisia succeeded not just because it's a small country which is, has a high level of education and has been having a good agenda on women's issues and all the stuff we mentioned, the literacy rate, but also, we know the saying, too many cooks spoil the soup. So whenever you have foreign hands and foreign intervention and foreign powers, it just breaks everything down. The case of Lebanon, the case of Syria, for God's sake, is a living example, right, in front of our eyes, which is tragic. So I definitely think this is an important point, and I hope that we can address it in future scholarship. Thank you so much. Sean?
Yeah, I was picking up on this notion of outside interference. When it comes to the grassroots, it's like I'm sure there are outside groups who are in these various countries with a variety of different political agendas. It's like, how much was that a force? I mean, we could look at the U.S. I mean, how much was the U.S. on the ground trying to promote democratic action, and how much it was really homegrown?
Yes, very important point also. These are all excellent questions, but every question needs a whole lecture to address it. This is an excellent question too, because we had voices and powers from the diaspora, right? Activism in the diaspora is a very, very important point that I think also deserves more attention and more work, in terms of academic contribution and academic writing. Indeed, you are right on target, because a lot of these activists were inspired by those in the diaspora. In the case of Egypt, they were receiving all of these back and forth messages and texting and internet connection with young activists in Tunisia, telling them, don't take your ID with you to Tahrir Square. Make sure you bring a lot of water. If you're a veiled woman, put some onion and vinegar under your scarf to fight the tear gas. Does not appeal to me in any way, shape, or form. Vinegar and onion under the scarf, no. But this is to kind of really help you with the tear gas effect, okay? So giving very, very practical advice, okay, to them to help them with their form of activism. So we saw this kind of interaction back and forth, and now as we speak, there are so many also activist groups in the diaspora trying to offer, like I said, resources, help to victims, to rape victims, to Syrian refugees, to people who have been, all over the region and all over the world, really. They need material help and they need psychological support, and these groups are trying to use their cyber activism and cyber feminism to try to really kind of make a loud voice that can be heard on behalf of these women, right? So on behalf of activists and freedom fighters more generally. And I think more scholarship needs to be devoted to this particular point. Thank you.
What about outside the diaspora? I mean, is there other influences?
You mean, like, for example, from the West?
Yes.
Yes, there have been also some Western, activists, and we have seen in this very interesting case like a two-way effect, really. It is one of the interesting cases where we saw a two-way effect for the very first time. Usually we see everything is coming from the West to the rest. Though I don't like the West versus the rest kind of, terminology, but we have always seen that one-way flow. Something happens in the West, and then people emulate it. Yes, there have been some Western activists who have been engaging with some of the local activists inside the Arab world. But also for the very first time, we have seen what is happening in the Arab world having echoes in the Western world, right? Occupy Wall Street, we have, Occupy Philly, all of that stuff. In Tel Aviv, in Israel, there have been some demonstrations and protests where people actually had tents, and they were talking about issues related to housing and housing prices, And they were using the very similar style that was pretty much used in Tahrir Square in Egypt and elsewhere. So for the first time, we saw actually also a reversal, and it became a two-way interactive process across international borders, which was very interesting. Thank you. Peter?
Thank you, Sahar, for a very inspiring talk. So we all know that you publish a book, it comes out, but you basically finish that book manuscript sometimes even a year ahead of it coming out. So I'm wondering what you think about what you've written in this book and what your colleagues have written in the light of most recent developments. One, the landslide victory of General Assisi in Egypt, which is something that actually relates to the previous question. What makes Egypt maybe different from Tunisia? I mean, Egypt, where you have a space for the army, which seems to be entirely untouched by everything that's going on in the public sphere. The army can do whatever it wants. You know, things may happen, revolution may happen in Egypt. The army's not affected by it. You know, that's what it seems like. And B, Assisi is one. Second one is the incredible delegitimization of Facebook over the past weeks. It seems to be a model of the past now. It turns out to be not only a liberating medium, but also an oppressive medium. And maybe even more oppressive than liberating, as it turns out to be. So what effect does that have on your argumentations in this book, but even more broadly speaking, what effect does it have on your conceptualizing, theorizing about the effects of social media?
Do you have 2 hours? We can be here for the next 2 hours. 1 hour for the first question, 1 hour for the second question. Of course, the tricky part about the book here is an edited volume. It's my first time. I don't know, of course, some of you who actually had the brave opportunity to actually do this huge undertaking of co-editing. It's not easy at all. If you're writing your own stuff, you can always go back and change things. Like, just to give you an example, sometimes I don't necessarily agree with everything that one of the authors is writing, right? And I'm like, I don't really feel good about it. You know what I mean? It's not my work. It's her work. It's her contribution. You see what I'm saying? So there are so many issues we can talk about that. It's not easy. It's not like this is my book and it's from A to Z my ideas. So I try to, in the presentation, to be honest and fair in terms of trying as much as possible. It's very difficult to summarize 3 or 4 years of work in 30, 40 minutes. That's not an easy thing. But of course, it being pretty much an eclectic and diverse book by diverse contributors, it would be hard to answer your 2 questions from the perspective of every one of the 11 contributors to the book volume. But from my own perspective, the first question that you asked somehow links to what my colleague here, Nick, has been saying earlier about the top-down versus the bottom-up, because yes, we do have layers. We talk about layers of invisibility and marginalization. We have layers of challenges, for God's sake, in the Arab world, politically, socially, and legally, and culturally, and economically, and the list can go on and on. But definitely, having autocracy and dictatorship is one thing that really sets a very big hurdle and a very big obstacle for any civic engagement movement to grow. If I'm going to start an opposition movement tomorrow morning, or an NGO or a party, but I know that the next day I'm going to be in jail, I'm not going to be encouraged to start it. Let's face it, let's be honest, right? So I mean, whenever you have this shrinking margin of freedom and democracy, people are scared. We know that the last election has been a sham, has not been really representing anything real, anything that really Egyptians truly felt or believed in. It's been pretty much, we know the outcome. And it has been like that for many, many, many years under Mubarak. We always had the joke of, we're going to be surprised tomorrow. Is it going to be Mubarak or Mubarak? That's it. Is he going to win or succeed? So basically, you don't have the option. So it's really very heartbreaking, and don't get me started because I can go on talking about this for hours, and very painful for me on many levels, personally, individually, as a scholar, as an academic, as a person, as an Egyptian, to see this happening, because it's a reversal in the whole process, and definitely this is likely to impede any progress in the area of democracy or reform and women's rights and everything else. Just having women ministers, he appointed like 6 women ministers, in my opinion, that is not necessarily an indication of any real progress on the ground. And that has been one of the arguments I was trying to make, right? That basically it has to come from people, it has to come from the grassroots and across the board, otherwise it would be tokenism and it's not going to be effective. Your second question was about Facebook. there has been a lot of work and a lot of writing lately about stuff in the media and online about fake news, right? And we are seeing again influences between different countries, in this case not necessarily in a very positive direction, right? But kind of really shedding doubt on the credibility of media and shedding the credibility of news and trying to say, okay, so this is all fake news, or this is all wrong news, or this is all not to be trusted. Again, I would go back to my piece of advice, if I may say so, which is really the middle ground of cyber realism. We don't want to overcredit these tools, because at the end of the day, citizen journalism, you're not getting people from the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, you're getting citizen journalists, just average people like me and you, right? So in many cases there can be mistakes. It's your job as a receiver of the information to do the fact checking. Try to fact check whatever you receive and don't take it at face value. But that does not mean we should go to the other extreme or of discrediting these sources of information altogether and saying, okay, now Facebook is going to be, instead of a liberating force, a repressive force. You know what I mean? Like, these are big words: liberating force, repressive force, right? And I have some colleagues here who are rhetoricians, right? These are big words to use. It was not a liberating force, it was the activists who were the liberating force. It was a catalyst. It was just supplementary aid. It was just helping the process, an amplifier that you put like this microphone. That's it, right? But I'm the one who's talking, not the microphone. All right? So the same thing when it comes to social media and new media. We don't want to hail them too much and credit them and overcredit them, and we don't want to discredit them and to shed doubt on their value or credibility or contribution altogether. Let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Take the good and leave the bad. Last question. He had his hand up for a long time.
So, first of all, thank you for
Can you
the
introduce
presentation.
Can you introduce yourself?
Mark Ginsberg from the College of Education. More importantly, thank you and your colleague for the book, which I look forward to reading in more detail than obviously covered. First question is a simple one. Is it going to come out in Arabic? And if not, think about the implications of that decision. But what I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about, I thought very appropriately focused on the political, the social, and the legal dimensions. In your conclusions, though, you seem to give priority to the political in terms of which countries had more success. You mentioned briefly some of the legal changes in the region that took place as a result of kind of copying Tunisia, if that's the right word. But could you talk briefly about some of the social changes that occurred even in the context where the political changes didn't go exactly in the direction you would want them?
Right. So the first part about the Arabic language, I'll try to be brief, I know we're out of time. The Arabic language, this has been something I've been thinking about and really wanting to do with my previous two books. The first book, Islam.com, and the second one, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, which I co-authored with a colleague, Professor Mohammed Nawawi. And we've been really trying to get them translated to Arabic, something that we have not done yet. But I do believe it's important also for Arabic-speaking audiences to be able to read this kind of scholarship and not just to have it read by English-speaking audiences only, for obvious reasons, because the book is about the Arab regions, about Arab women and Arab women's activism. So this is really something, and maybe you can give me some advice afterwards about maybe some of the publishers in the Arab region who can really be interested in undertaking this whole thing. And I would love to see it, of course, written in Arabic as well, that's for sure. And the second part of your question about the prioritization of the political, the political has always been what's been catching the eye. And we have been talking in my classes with my students about the principle of when it leads. Also when there is conflict and war and violence and bloodshed, the cameras get rolling and people get interested, unfortunately. But there is a lot of good work that's being done despite all of that. Despite of everything we have seen, the reversals in freedom and democratization and so on. Yes, there have been groups that are still active up till now. Even the group, No to Military Trials for Civilians, they are less involved, but they did not completely disappear or completely vanish. There are still groups advocating for sexual harassment, against sexual, not for sexual harassment, that would be disastrous, advocating for getting rid of sexual harassment and against sexual harassment altogether, advocating for women's rights. Yes, there are still voices, and yes, there are still efforts, and yes, there are still initiatives here and there. It is just that they need to be, yes, as we said before, we need to create these kinds of coalition buildings, this kind of center, middle ground of building these coalitions moving forward and trying to also solve the chicken and egg question and puzzle we were talking about before in terms of what comes first. And these are not easy questions to answer. If I had the answer for all of them, I would have been on CNN every single day. Thank you all so much.